Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started. I hope you all had a good night's sleep because we're going to be talking about Brexit. I'm Tom Nuttall from the Economist magazine. I'm based in Brussels. It turns out that this panel is wonderfully timed because once again, unexpected political developments in the UK have turned the Brexit debate on its head. Not for the first time. The electoral earthquake of last week, the humiliation of the Prime Minister, who was seeking a mandate for her hard variety of Brexit, her failure to secure a majority. Now we have some people wondering if this hard Brexit that she placed before the electorate may now be usurped by a softer type. Perhaps a way can be found for Britain to remain inside the single market or to maintain some sort of common customs arrangement with the rest of the EU. But the electoral result also raises uncertainty on the European side. They're very well prepared. They've spent the year since the referendum organising, negotiating teams, guidelines, directives, and they're ready to go. But of course, all of this stuff was built on what they were hearing from London. And if that's about to change, then that creates difficulties for Europe as well. They want to keep this process orderly, stable. They want to avoid it infecting their other business. And of course, all the while, the clock is running down. It's almost 3 months since Article 50 was triggered. 3 months of a 2-year process is not a trivial amount of time. And as yet, there have been no talks. We hope that they're about to get underway in Brussels next week, but we don't yet have a confirmation of that. So there's a lot to discuss. I'm joined here by, on my right, Stefaan Rynck, who conducts outreach to think tanks and other organisations in the task force of Michel Barnier, who will be the EU's lead Brexit negotiator. On my left, I have Tim Oliver, who is a research director at Brexit Analytics, an associate at LSE Ideas, which is a foreign policy think tank at the London School of Economics, and is on his way to Florence later this year. To my immediate left, Emmy van Deurzen, who is director at New Europeans. And on my right, I have Martin Povejšil, okay, I was worried about that one, who is the Czech ambassador to the European Union. We're going to have a brief discussion up here, and we will turn it over to the audience for questions as soon as we can. I've been asked to draw your attention to something called Slido, slido.com. If you log on to this website and input the hashtag PES for Prague European Summit 2017, there are several things that you can do. You can suggest some questions of your own. You can vote on other people's questions, and the ones that receive the highest number of votes will appear on a monitor in front of me here. And halfway through the discussion, I'm going to put my own question to you, which will appear in the polling part of the website, and you can vote on that, and we'll deliver the result at the end. So with that, maybe I can start with you, Stefaan. The task force, Michel Barnier's task force, is by all accounts very well prepared for these talks. You have very clear negotiating directives on the first phase of the talks, on the financial settlement, on the rights of citizens, on the border issue. Now we have an election which seems to upset some of the assumptions that people have had about the approach that Britain is going to take to Brexit. From your perspective, what changed last Thursday?
Well, thank you, Tom, and good morning, everyone. And thank you, Tom, for noting that we are well prepared as EU 27. I think Michel Barnier has worked very hard with all the authorities, the Czech authorities, all the 26 other member states, indeed to come to these common positions. And from the EU 27 side, nothing has changed because of the elections on the other side of the channel, I would say. For what lies ahead of us as the first challenges. And what I mean by that is we have identified positions, we have a clear timetable ahead of us as defined by the treaty, and we have a clear negotiation structure which we would like to discuss as soon as possible with our British friends. And we have always said we should start by tackling the uncertainties that are caused by Brexit itself, by the withdrawal of the UK from the EU. And those are, as Tom said in the introduction, the rights of citizens, the financial settlement, on which we have negotiating directives, but also position papers, which we have published and transmitted already to the UK authorities. We need to tackle a number of other issues that are defined in these negotiation directives that the 27 have established together. And that's what we need to tackle first in what is this first phase of the negotiations, what we call the sequencing. I actually must commend the organizer of the Prague summit for having a similar sequencing, because post-lunch we have a debate on UK trade, EU trade relationships, and that's kind of a reflection of the negotiation structure we also have put forward. Because the scoping of the future relationship should start as soon as possible, but only at a time when we, as the European Council told us, have reached sufficient progress on the first issues. And I finish by saying that from our perspective, this sequencing and this architecture is there to help reach a deal with our UK friends. Because it's important to take the drama as soon as possible out of these negotiations. And there is a lot of potential for drama in those first set of issues that we have identified. And it is also important that in view of the orderly withdrawal agreement, we start in the logic that has been given to us with these issues to tackle the uncertainties that are there first. Because you can only, by taking away uncertainties, can you only reassure the authorities in the 27, the parliaments in the 27, that we have a sufficient foundation and a sufficient level of confidence to construct a new partnership with the UK authorities.
Thank you, Stefan. Tim, you're based in London, but you watch the EU fairly closely. As Stefan mentioned, which I should have also mentioned, we will have a subsequent panel which is going to focus specifically on the trade aspects of this. Now, a lot of people are talking about that now in London. They're wondering if we are headed towards a different approach on something like hard or soft Brexit. But on the immediate issues which are going to confront us, which remain whatever the sort of the ultimate destination is, the issues that Stefan was just mentioning, do you think that the British government is ready for these talks? Do you think it understands what is at stake? And how high do you think the chances are of an immediate bust-up? Because in Brussels, they're very worried about that.
Yes. Tom, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. First of all, you said, is the British government ready? I think the first thing that sprang into my mind there was, are the British people ready? Is the British Parliament ready? Is the Labour Party ready? Is the Conservative Party ready? It's not just about Theresa May and the British government and the civil service and the negotiating team here. We've had a referendum on Europe, we've had a general election which was supposed to be about Brexit, but we've not really had a debate, really, about what Brexit's supposed to mean. Theresa May famously said, Brexit means Brexit. And I can't remember who it was who said, it was a journalist who said, that's a bit like telling a toddler bedtime means bedtime. There will be a bedtime. Where, when, and how, however, as any parent knows, is open to debate. In terms of readiness for this, there's a lot of expectations at the moment that things will change over the next few weeks, given the parliamentary arithmetic, given what's going on within the Conservative Party. And I'd start there perhaps with, I'm hoping I'm wrong, but with a more sceptical view that actually if you look at the balance within the government in terms of Michael Gove coming in, that doesn't necessarily bode well for a soft Brexit. You look at the arithmetic in Parliament, and the Labour Party has its own divisions on this, so even there we're not too sure where numbers will actually go. Perhaps be a bit more optimistic on the parliamentary front, and even on the public front. I think the reason why Theresa May did so badly in this election was because she expected to be able to run it as a Brexit campaign, without talking about Brexit, by the way, forgetting that the referendum itself wasn't really about Brexit, it was about domestic matters. And therefore Jeremy Corbyn sailed into the front when he was able to talk about things more effectively than she was. But in terms of a bust-up, yes, there's still everything there, the kind of a toxic mix for an almighty bust-up in the next few weeks, leaving Britain in a position where it doesn't actually know what it wants to do, because the numbers in the Commons could, or well, mainly the Commons, could go in any direction. They could go for a soft Brexit, they could go for a hard Brexit, so things are still very much up in the air.
Thank you. Emmy, I think you bring a slightly different perspective to this story. You've been focused on, in part, the personal impact that the outcome of this referendum has had for individuals, particularly European citizens living in the United Kingdom, who still don't know what their future is. Nothing is guaranteed, although there's lots of goodwill on either side. Could you tell us exactly what you think the difficulties are and what we're doing about them and what we should be doing about them?
Okay, so I have been working with the EU citizens in the UK, 3.5 million of them, who overnight, a year ago, discovered that they were no longer welcome in the country that they had put their roots down, and who became incredibly disenfranchised in the process, many of whom have had mental health problems, many of whom are becoming radicalized, by the way, as well. They're extremely dissatisfied and annoyed, both with the United Kingdom for ignoring them and with the EU for promising for 40 years that if you had EU citizenship, you had free movement, you could relocate anywhere, you could settle in another country, only so many years later to find yourself bereft of that security and having to consider pulling up your roots when your children are actually British and having to contemplate leaving. And why do they have to contemplate leaving? Well, because the UK government has made it deliberately very difficult for UK citizens to remain in the country. I myself I am Dutch by origin, lived in France for many years, have been in the UK for 40 years, and it took me a year to obtain my UK citizenship because the Home Office rejected my application twice, falsely, forgetting that it had made a commitment to me in 1984 of indefinite leave to remain, totally discarding that and claiming I should go back to the drawing board to get permanent residency, which of course I've had for 40 years. So that's extremely offensive. It is not the right way to treat people, and I think the European Union has to take some responsibility for that as well. We should have prevented this from happening. This is like a humanitarian crisis under our eyes, which we haven't overseen, we haven't prevented, and we aren't really talking about very much. I'm pleased to say that the European Commission has now given more or less unilateral guarantees to the UK citizens, only 1.5 million of them, who live elsewhere in Europe. But they will still have issues because they'll still have to have guarantees from the UK government that they will have pension rights and they will have health care arrangements in place. So they're not out of the woods yet either. But the UK citizens have had absolutely no affirmation of anything, and it is a very dire situation. And of course, to start with, it was a very unfair situation, since none of us, 3.5 million of us, were allowed a vote on that very crucial referendum that decided about our very futures. And I think that is unconscionable to allow 3.5 million people to be muted in something that is absolutely centrally about their own personal future. So there are many lessons to learn for the European Union to prevent this kind of thing ever happening again. And we should be learning those lessons, and we should also put in much more effort to ease the way for these people who have become hostage to fortune because of the arrangements we have made together and for which we have shared responsibility in the European Union.
Thank you very much. We're told that David Davis will come to Brussels with a, quote, very generous offer for European citizens, European Union citizens living in Britain.
Well, that remains to be seen because it's very complex, and there are many people who will still fall between the cracks of that kind of arrangement.
It certainly is complex, so we'll see what it is that he brings to Mr. Barnier. Ambassador, I want to ask you to look at this issue from a slightly different perspective. As the permanent representative of a European Union member state, you are involved in the day-to-day goings-on in Brussels on security policy, on migration policy, on the single market, on a whole array of activities. In the long run, what do you think will be the impact on the remaining 27 member states of Britain's departure? On the one hand, we sometimes hear concerns that the absence of a large pro-trade liberal force might shove the European Union in a sort of a more protectionist direction. On the other hand, Britain's absence removes a brake on some of those issues that other countries might have liked to move forward on, such as defence and security. Which direction do you see the EU going in post-Brexit?
Thank you, Tom, and good morning to everyone. Well, my take on this is that Brexit, whichever way it will happen, will fundamentally change the balances of power inside the EU, and it will inevitably also change the way we operate vis-à-vis the institutions and among member states and between member states in future. It is kind of tricky, from my point of view, to anticipate what the reaction by the Commission might be, in the sense of how the Commission will draft its proposals presented to member states, because so far, of course, Commission had always to factor in the presence of UK in the EU and design the text in a way so that the UK could fit in. If that changes dramatically, we might see new frictions and tensions among the member states, because as a consequence of the change of balance of power, the drafts may shift one way without taking into account the opinion of smaller and more peripheric member states. So this is something that concerns us, and we hope that collectively we will have the wisdom to keep the balance inside the EU under those new post-Brexit conditions. It won't be easy for anyone. It won't be easy for member states, and it won't be easy, certainly, for the European Commission either. But there will be a lot at stake in that post-Brexit process.
Just briefly, do you see any opportunities? I mean, when you were talking about different proposals that we might get from the Commission, look at what they're proposing on defence, for example. I find it hard to imagine that they would have acted in the same way had Britain still been in there. Britain has always been a big sceptic.
That is quite clear that defence and security, in fact, is already at this moment an area where we can expect swifter process. And of course, in the discussions that we have had so far, we could also feel, how UK toned down its narrative on defence and security, while stressing that after Brexit, UK will remain interested and engaged in European defence and security. I think this is really very important, both for UK and the EU 27, because obviously we live in one area, will continue to live in one area, and we will face the same challenges and concerns. The other area where I could envisage a swifter or a more pressure towards progress is the Eurozone, Euro area integration. That may not necessarily be a direct consequence of Brexit, but certainly the fact of UK leaving can function as a sort of a political catalyst of that process, but it will depend on many other factors whether this goes ahead or not.
Yes, I've been struck by, on the Eurozone issue, you hear European commissioners now say, after Brexit, the Eurozone will now account for, I think it's 85% of EU GDP. And the implication is clear that, we are now the core. The core EU is the Eurozone. When you had Britain, a very large economy outside of the Euro, it was harder to make that case. So I think there may be a shift coming there. Stefan, I wanted to bring some of the concerns that Emmy outlined to you. She said this should not have been allowed to happen. We should make sure that it never happens again. Having gone through this sort of peculiar, sort of phony war period of the last year, where there have been no direct negotiations, but both sides have been thinking about what's at stake, and the rights of citizens, as it should have done, has gone to the top of the list. Is there anything that we should have done differently, that either side should have done differently? The British government was approaching other European governments in December, seeking some form of early guarantee, and they were rebuffed. Was that a mistake, do you think?
I'll come back to your question. On the first, what Emmy says, I think we all agree that this should stay as a unique situation. The Article 50 was put in the treaty to make clear that no country is held hostage in the EU as a member, basically. Brexit is the first time that Article 50 has been activated, and we, of course, hope and we will work extremely hard as well to make sure that that is the last time that such kind of event happens. So the uniqueness of this event has to be stressed, in my view. On your question, should we have done something differently? I think it is very important to understand the overall challenge ahead of us on citizens' rights. That is that we need to have legally solid rights for these people, both for the UK people in the EU27 as well as for the EU citizens in the UK. Now, the only way to give precise rights directly vested to these citizens is through the Article 50 agreement, and make them enforceable through the Article 50 agreement. So we could not have started discussing this before the activation of Article 50. We needed the activation by the UK of Article 50 to get down to business on the citizens' rights. Now, the activation was 3 months ago. Because of the elections, we are where we are. So now we need to sit down at the negotiation table very quickly, and hopefully as of next week we can listen to the UK's reaction to our position paper, which is very clear, and that comes back to Emmy's point, and I conclude with that, saying that the rights of these people should be guaranteed under EU law post-Brexit for the lifetime of the people concerned, with the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice attached to that. So that is the best way that we have seen possible with the 27 member states to make sure that these rights are indeed enforceable, precise, and listed also in that Article 50 agreement. So you couldn't have done it without Article 50.
But you mentioned just at the end there, subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, as you know, that's a very tricky thing for the British government to agree to. I'd be surprised if this quote-unquote generous offer that they bring to the table next week is going to involve an agreement that the rights that they guarantee can be subject to the jurisdiction of the ECJ. Can you see a landing point there, or do you think that's going to be a red line for the EU27?
I mean, there's no generosity in our view in guaranteeing that these people can continue their lives as they have built them up today, echoing some of the comments that were made earlier. So we have been very clear in our position paper that we need the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice as a guarantee to make these rights legally enforceable and make sure that we have the rock-solid guarantees that this will happen.
Okay, the questions have started to come in on the app. Yeah, sure, yeah, go have a response.
Well, it seems to me that there are some other things that the EU could have done to prevent this from happening. One is that we should have something in place for conflict resolution and reconciliation, alternative dispute resolution within the functioning of the EU, in which case I think we may have kept the UK inside of the EU rather than seeing Brexit at all. And secondly and thirdly, I think there should be regulations around Article 50 that require any country taking a vote, a referendum vote on leaving the EU, to do so by a 2/3 majority rather than a simple majority. That is common standard practice for big changing decisions, and if that had been the case, then there would not have been Brexit. Thirdly, I think there should have been a requirement to allow any EU citizens resident in that country to have a vote in such a referendum. Now, I can assure you, if those 3 measures had been in place, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about Brexit. In fact, the simple fact of EU citizens having the vote in the referendum would have turned the referendum vote around and would have been a Remain vote.
I'm not sure it would have withdrawn the sting of the issue in British politics, though, if it was only EU citizens who changed the result. That we may be we may not be sitting here today talking about the Brexit process, but we may be talking about an extremely toxic issue inside British politics.
Absolutely correct. But that is something about the perception of migration in Europe, isn't it? What happened in the UK is that we had a conflation being made quite deliberately by some people between the Syrian refugee crisis and the UK being part of the EU, which was entirely wrong. And there are sensitivities in the UK about migration because net migration is much higher in the UK than in other countries for the simple reason that there aren't as many English or British people wanting to go live in other European countries as there are Europeans who are good enough in their English to come live and work in the UK. So maybe the European Union should think about that and think about the difference there is between migration quotas for countries that feel afraid of getting overwhelmed by migrants versus countries that feel it's all very great to have that flexibility.
Okay, let's not tread onto that minefield right now. That's a very tricky subject and a slightly different one. There was a question that appeared a moment ago that I want to put to Tim, which was about the relationship, I think, between the first and the second phases of the negotiations to come. And the question was, is it really reasonable to expect the British government to sign up to a very substantial financial settlement, up to 100 billion euros gross, without knowing the future terms of its trading relationship with the EU? Now, obviously, lots of concerns in the government about that, but that is the approach that's been laid out in the guidelines for Mr. Barnier. How do you think that the British government can respond to that?
Oh, wow. Speaking for the British government now. I mean, the British government is in a position where, it's caught one in terms of the domestic pressure to pay as little as possible. There's no figure that's kind of small enough for the Daily Mail or the Daily Express. So this is where I think Theresa May faces an incredible problem where, yes, she could potentially face, a kind of that moment of crunch within the Conservative Party especially. So getting just over that hurdle to begin with is going to be a major sticking point. But in terms of commitments from the rest of the European Union, I think the wording of Article 50 talks about the need to negotiate an exit, but then I can't remember the exact wording, with a view to the new relationship. So there's no even legal requirement that it has to be negotiated as part of the exit agreement. But as I think we all know, and as I think even Theresa May knows, and the British government was hinting at, there will need to be some form of time extension beyond the 2 years. Let's not forget it's why she kind of called the general election anyway, to kick the next election to 2022. So I think, without wanting to kind of speak for the British government in terms of what I think they should do, there's a realization probably that things are going to need to they're going to have to concede to the EU on the exit agreement before moving on to the trade agreement, because the cards are all in the European Union's hands here in terms of timing, in terms of trade relationships and so forth. Although, as we all know, there's costs to be borne on both sides from a hard Brexit. But, as I said, the potential for a crunch and this all collapsing remains very real. I would not overlook that, especially on the financial front.
And I think that speaks to the point that you were making earlier about not just the government, but the parliament and voters not having been prepared properly for this. I mean, the government has spoken very, very little. Theresa May said very little about a financial settlement. She sort of hinted obliquely at it a couple of times. And yet, when you consider this in the round, I mean, the terms of the ultimate trading relationship that we settle on, orders of magnitude more significant than 10 or 20 billion here or there on the financial settlement. So, but it's easy for people like us to sit here and say that. Do you think that the politics can work like that, given how little groundwork has been done by the government to prepare people for this bill?
Yes, I mean, especially given we've been through an election where one of the biggest issues was just stagnant wages, that people are not seeing kind of value for money in terms of from government and so forth, that people have made a lot of the fact that young people voted for Jeremy Corbyn, but actually more shockingly, as the polling has shown, it was 30 and 40-year-olds that voted Labour as well. People who have mortgages, people who are kind of, who's not seen their wages rise. So for them, the issue will certainly come down to, so why are we giving this money to the European Union? I wouldn't discount that kind of weighing on people's minds, because we've not had that debate in the UK about what the rest of the European Union actually wants. The debate has always been about what the UK wants. Okay, that's understandable to some extent, but we've ignored the fact for many years that there are 27 member states who each have their own domestic pressures, each have their own trading relationships with the UK, and will therefore have to reach agreement with the UK over what happens next. The UK has often thought of itself as just the topic of the Brexit negotiations. So the debate in the UK, including in Parliament, where, as I think anybody who follows the debate amongst MPs, the failure to understand the difference between the customs union, the single market and so forth, even there the debate is not actually that advanced. There are lots of MPs who don't fully understand where this is going. So just the lack of knowledge is still quite shocking.
I couldn't agree more. If we're thinking about what the rest of the EU might seek to achieve, what sort of outcome it might be looking for, Ambassador, in the first phase of the talks, I think it's fairly clear. You want as much money as you can from the Brits, and that applies both for net recipients who don't want to lose out from the next round of budget negotiations, but also, of course, for net payers who don't want to have to make up the shortfall. You want the rights of your citizens in the United Kingdom to be guaranteed to the fullest extent possible in law. But if we start to think ahead a little bit, as Tim was saying, often the discussion is sort of framed by what it is that Britain might want, with the extent of its integration into the European single market. But of course, this has a significant impact on the well-being, the prosperity of all 27 member states. So can you give us a Czech perspective on what sort of outcome for Brexit you think would be optimal?
Well, it's hard to say without knowing what the UK wants, as Tim pointed out right now. But we would, of course, hope for and expect an economic relation as close as possible, as little burdened by bureaucracy and tariff and non-tariff barriers as possible. What form it should take, well, that's up to the discussion and that negotiating process that will start in the second phase. But I think there is agreement among the 27, and I hear it as a kind of a chorus of the EU 27 that no cherry picking is possible. What we heard or read from Theresa May, that she might be following a line of thinking, to be as close as within the single market as possible in individual sectors or economic areas. Well, that certainly will be confronted with a rejection from the EU 27. My guess is, that it will be very challenging for the EU 27 to keep this total unity among ourselves in that phase of the process, and it will really, take a lot of effort, to preserve that unity. We will have to count on attempts from the UK side, to divide the EU 27, and that will be the real challenging phase of the negotiation.
Yeah.
Could I just make a suggestion about that? As a professor of psychology and psychotherapy, it seems to me obvious that this is a large group process with many individual interests and desires and fears that somebody should manage in a responsible and professional way. Otherwise, every chance there is that it will go wrong in some way. And I think this is what has happened. I agree with you completely, I don't think that the European Union has realized the lack of knowledge and understanding in the UK about what the European Union can provide for the UK. There is a complete lack of understanding, and the whole debate has been about trade and the economy, and we have ignored civil society and the interests of individual people. We have ignored things like, for instance, pulling out of Euratom means we don't have access to isotopes anymore. What does that mean? Well, it means we can't do cancer treatments in hospital anymore. Pulling out of higher education arrangements has meant that we realize 1/3 of academics in higher education are actually from EU countries. They're all getting headhunted by Luxembourg at the moment for some strange reason. So higher education is going to see a brain drain. There are lots and lots of ways in which for 42 years the UK has in fact woven its fate together with the European Union in ways that nobody in the UK grasps or understands. We haven't done good PR about this. We have allowed the debate to become completely mired in these economic and trade conversations. There is a lot more to it. I haven't even started on peacekeeping. A very interesting debate we had this morning at the French Alliance. Very interesting indeed. We should be talking about how us together are going to be more peaceful in our relationships, rather than having a bun fight about one of us wanting to leave. We shouldn't let the UK leave. More than 50% now don't even want to leave anymore.
Stefan, yeah, go ahead. And then I want to take another question from here for you, and then we'll go to the audience.
I'll just take 30 seconds to the issue. We haven't thought about civil society groups, and I speak for the EU27 side. And maybe it surprised you by saying, look at the financial settlement and what's the link? But the link there is that the budget of the EU is there with guarantees for committed money to, amongst other, civil society groups who are active in society, in vocational training. I mean, most of the EU is an investment budget, and investment benefits real people. So on the EU27 side, it's not just about money and the way it was formulated earlier, it's about the real challenges behind it, beneficiaries behind this budget, who count on that budget for the execution of their projects. And so the financial settlement sounds like an accounting issue or a politically hot potato. It's also a human issue.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question from the monitor here, and this relates directly to the issue that you just raised, which is if we're thinking about the future relationship, as you say, trade is at the heart of it, and it's what everybody is focused on. But there's a very important foreign policy and security dimension as well. The UK is one of the only serious military powers inside the European Union. Once it leaves, it'll only be France. There presumably will be large incentives on both sides to forge some sort of relationship that binds Britain into foreign policy and security decision-making structures. And if there is that goodwill on both sides, then the hope is that that discussion may be a little bit easier than the trading one. But I wonder if I can get some perspective on you. Maybe, Ambassador, you have some views on that.
I mentioned that in my previous comments, that no doubt, sharing the same space and sharing the same challenges, there is good reason for developing a robust relation in security, defense, and foreign policy. And so far, we have heard only reassuring comments from the British authorities. How do we translate it into a formalized relation. That's to be seen, but I would not be really very afraid and be rather confident, that will be possible if that will remains there. And let me add, I do not see strategically or geopolitically how the UK could go unilaterally any other way than in close cooperation in these areas with the EU. So this is one of the areas, where I'm least worried about the future relations, because realities and external pressures are so compelling and will continue to be so compelling that we will simply have to do that.
Thank you. Okay, I think maybe I can go to the audience now. And in the meantime, I'm going to give you a question to think about yourselves, which you'll be able to vote on the page, which is to think about the future of the EU without Britain. Do you think that Brexit in the long term will be a good thing for the EU or a bad thing for the EU? And I think our colleagues are going to put this up on the site and you'll be able to vote on it, and we can give you a result at the end. So while you're thinking about that, maybe I can go to the audience. I think you've got mics in front of you, and I'll pick sort of 2 or 3 questions, then we can come back, and then we'll be able to go for a second round. Please, sir, in the back here. Yep.
Hello, everyone. My take on Brexit is that it was...
Can you tell us who you are?
Yeah, sorry. I'm Philippos Proedrou from the University of South Wales in the UK. So my take on Britain is that it is the result of a very, very disingenuous political gamble. All the things, the issues that we have to deal with are just the side effects and the results of that. The political gamble of Cameron, Theresa May's elections that backfired. So my question is, in this logic, what is the desirable outcome now for the European Union, and what is the strategy put in place to achieve the most? And I mean, we have to be taking into account the ever-shifting political reality in Britain and try to exploit it so that European interests are maximized. But what does this exactly mean? Keeping Britain closer, giving a good lesson for the others? What future for European integration and what role for Britain? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take 1 or 2 more. Do I see? Or maybe, yes, over here.
It's Chris Morris from BBC. Both Wolfgang Schäuble and Emmanuel Macron have suggested this week that the door would still be open if Britain were to change its mind. I'm not suggesting at the moment that is going to happen, but I'm interested in the thoughts of the panel on who might prefer the door not to be open. Do you think any one of the member states or any of the institutions would want to set conditions for a withdrawal, if you like, of the Article 50 letter? Thank you.
Okay, and I can take 1 more if we have any, but I don't see any hands, so, yep, okay, please.
I think coming back to this issue of the European Union's branding of itself and the European project, Britain has considered Europeans as invaders ever since Julius Caesar, and we all know other historical examples, and that seems deeply embedded in the British consciousness, and somehow, despite the enormous benefits of being part of Europe, which everybody has mentioned, the ordinary person doesn't seem to have grasped the idea that the EU isn't just the latest kind of invader. Is it too late to somehow sell a different message? I know that if the EU were to mount a publicity campaign in Britain, it would simply be regarded as yet another kind of invasion. So it's a very tricky moment. But is there a way of somehow bridging that gap, not just at the political level, but the individual level of British citizens?
Thank you. Okay, so 3 questions. The first, I think, was what should the European Union strategy towards Britain be, given what we have learned about political realities in Britain? Should it be to keep Britain close or at some distance? Second question was, if some member states would like to keep the door open to Britain, who would want to keep it firmly shut? And then a final question, how can the Europeans convince the Brits that they're not there to act as invaders? So, I don't know, the first question, maybe, is that one for Tim, maybe?
Okay, I was actually thinking of the third question just for a moment.
Do that one as well.
One of the best analyses that we now have of why people voted for Brexit last year is in a book called Brexit, Why Britain Voted to Leave the European Union by Matt Goodwin, Harold Clark and Paul Whiteley, I think. And in there they show that if you were to present 10 words about the European Union, 5 positive and 5 negative, to Remain voters and Leave voters, even the Remain voters picked the negative words. So there's something here, not just about selling the UK in terms of shall we say, propaganda, and that's how it might be seen in the UK, but just the EU getting its own act together, because it was seen as dysfunctional, disunified, declining, and so forth. So the EU was a very hard sell on the doorstep in the United Kingdom. So the EU itself has improved over the past year. We've seen that. There's a lot more optimism. But certainly a year ago, just the sheer image of the European Union in the United Kingdom to a lot of people who only pay vague attention, as we all know in the news, was a very dysfunctional, negative organisation. Yes, that reflects also 40, 50 years of Eurosceptic and debate in the United Kingdom. And as Goodwin and co point out, a lot of the attitudes that led to Brexit had already been baked in the previous 10 to 15 years, mainly because of domestic reasons. It said something for David Cameron to one day say, I can walk away from the renegotiation and I will campaign for the UK to leave the European Union. Then in the campaign to turn around and say, actually this is a matter of war and peace and high politics. And the complete volte-face just didn't go down well. So there's got to be a consistency amongst the British political class over this matter.
Tim, do you think that, in retrospect, the referendum took place at a very bad time for the EU, at a refugee crisis, endless Eurozone woes, Greece about to fall out, Russia menacing Ukraine, populist parties on the rise everywhere, and now, as you say, the mood is significantly brighter. Had the referendum taken place when the news was better in the rest of Europe, do you think it might have had an impact on the outcome?
Given the closeness of the result, possibly. It wouldn't have been an overwhelming result in terms of 60% to stay in favour, because we're still not too sure whether Boris's decision to back Leave was possibly the thing that just tipped it in the end. So the EU and a whole other range of factors in terms of the government's popularity, austerity, and so forth. Would Trump's election have changed the result if the referendum had been after Trump being elected? Would people have distanced themselves from this type of result, as we might have seen? So, it's very difficult to see, and I think Goodwin and Nuttall do look into this in terms of rerunning the referendum, how often you'd have to rerun it to get a different result. And people do complain also about young people not turning out in the referendum last year. I think someone's run the numbers, and don't quote me on this, but it's somewhere like for 18 to 25-year-olds to have changed the result, there would need to have been 110% turnout. And for 18 to 45-year-olds, it would need to have been 93%. So it was also the old generation. Was anything going to shift them? And maybe now, because of what's happened with Theresa May's campaign, in terms of possibly losing their faith and so forth in terms of kind of the dementia tax and so forth, things will change. But you've got so many variables here to potentially lead to a different result that it's very difficult to say whether or not it would have been different.
Ambassador, I wanted to put the second question to you. We've heard a number of governments, not only France and Germany's, in the last few days say that the door would remain open for Britain were it to change its mind. Do you think that there are any countries that would want to make sure that that door remains closed?
I don't really think so. What might happen, of course, that some might be tempted, to add conditionalities to this reverse.
Joining the euro, for example.
No. That would be a stretch. I'm pretty sure. I don't think it would be, in theory, an automatic process, but I'm pretty sure that none of the governments would really dare block it. But can I just have a short comment on the first question? What is desirable result? I do not want to speak about the final result, but I think we have to bear in mind the process itself. And I think it would be very bad, if this process turns poisonous in the way that it really affects relations between continental nations and the UK as such, because if those relations turn bad, then this poison inevitably appears elsewhere, and we all, or 22 EU members are NATO allies. I think we would, all of us, those 22, hate to see this poison rechanneled through the back door into the alliance and how the alliance works. That would be a true disaster, and we have to think of it throughout the process, despite the fact that those negotiations will be difficult and maybe nasty on some occasions, but without having this present on our minds, we would, I think, fall into a major trap.
There's a question on the monitor that a lot of people evidently would like to have answered, and I'm afraid, Stefan, you're the obvious person to ask it to. It is from Ryan Heath. How flexible is Michel Barnier willing to be about the negotiating formats? Could he and David Davis absent themselves from the table to lower the political temperature? If everything starts to go wrong next week and they can't bear to be in the same room as each other, is there some flexibility around the format?
I've been working with Michel Barnier for quite a few years. I never felt hot in the room when I was with him. So I don't think from our side we will want to increase any political temperature. We will want to be rational about this, cool-headed, if I can build on the same analogy, and try and find the common interest and see where the differences are. And no doubt, in the beginning of the process, some of these differences will be miles or kilometers apart. But that's not a reason to, and building on what the ambassador just said, to raise political temperature. I think we need indeed to keep in mind the fact that we want a deal. And Tim earlier said there are other scenarios that are still possible, but our preferred scenario is obviously to build a deal and to come then to the first, or to strike a deal. And I think it's important to keep in mind indeed the ultimate objective of a close partnership with the UK. And in a way to build towards that, but we have a serious challenge ahead of us for the months to come, which is these priority topics that we have defined. And I think, if I can say one more thing on speed, perhaps, I think listening also to the other panels, it seems to me that we all have an interest in speedy progress. So we don't have an interest in all that much drama or increasing political temperatures. We really have a mutual interest on the UK side and the EU27 side to do this as rapidly as possible. Because behind all of this is, of course, the uncertainty which Brexit has created. And the sooner we can tackle that and address that, also in terms of scoping the future and constructing this new partnership, I think the better it will be for all parties.
Emmy, the last question that we had from the audience is something I imagine you might have an opinion on. The perception of Europeans as invaders. It was certainly true that during the referendum campaign, the European Commission was very, very careful to remain completely tight-lipped. I think that was probably the correct strategy, although obviously the result didn't go the way that they wanted it to. Now, in some respects, you might say that it's a little bit late now, the referendum has been lost, but actually there is still a lot at stake, and perhaps after last week's election result, there is more at stake than we had previously realised, because we do not know what variety of Brexit we're headed for. So how might you like to see the potential benefit of maintaining a closer relationship with the European Union sold inside the United Kingdom?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I am cautiously optimistic about what will happen and what certainly will happen in the next 5 years. One of the reasons for my optimism is personal. I have lived in the UK for 40 years. For 39 of those years, I felt absolutely and utterly on my own in my enthusiasm for Europe. In the past year, since the referendum, I have discovered that there are a lot of British people who are waking up to the importance of Europe. And for the first time, I have a real sense that the UK has never really opted into the EU. It has done it against its better will. It has done it reluctantly. And it has always and always given the EU bad press. I go back to your remark about the ignorance, because that is something I have also discovered in the past year. The ignorance is rife amongst the highest people in politics. There is no understanding about the democratic processes and nature of the EU. It is quite easy for Brits to dismiss the EU as undemocratic and claiming the UK to be much more democratic, which is quite funny in some ways. People do not understand that they have an MEP. Now, there is a question here, why is that? And why are people not using their MEPs? They do not know they are represented by their ministers. They do not understand about the European Parliament. They have no appreciation of the really hard work the European Union has done over all these 7 decades to maintain peace in Europe. And as a Dutch person whose family was destroyed by the Second World War, I feel extremely deeply about this. The UK population has no idea about what was suffered in the Second World War on the continent and why we have the European Union. And all of those things need to become part of the UK mentality for that to change. I have been part of several marches. I was part of organizing the big march in London. And when I was in Newcastle, for the march in Newcastle, we asked somebody in the street who was angry with us to, wave European flags, why are you so against the EU? And guess what he said, in total seriousness? Oh, we Brits, we don't need the continentals. All they do is invade us. We have stood up to them twice and we'll do it again because Germany has taken over. It's just Germany, the European Union. People have no idea about what it means to collaborate with 28 countries, to work through the conflicts and to come out with something that is valid and that helps us to maintain the highest standards of civilization and peaceful living together. And that is what we need to change in the UK.
May I just ask you began by saying that you detected a shift around yourself in the last year. Which part of the country do you live in?
I live both in South Yorkshire and in London.
Okay.
And of course in South Yorkshire, I seem to have had a huge effect because the whole of South Yorkshire is now red again. So
and you're taking the credit for that?
A lot of them, 75, 80% of people up there voted Brexit. And the reason they have voted for Jeremy Corbyn to some extent is the idea that there might be an open door towards Europe. People are beginning to think about this differently. Don't push us out too quickly. Engage the politicians in this kind of collaborative process where they're beginning to understand what they are going to lose if they walk away. Give them an appetite for it. I think this might be the moment the UK finally opts in rather than out. Maybe not this week, maybe not next year, but within the next few years, fingers crossed, that will happen. It's got to.
Well, we've only got 2 years, or less. We've got about 15 minutes left here. So I think I might go back to the audience for another round of questions if there are any, but we also have several more up on the monitor. So please raise your hand if there's anything that you'd like to ask the panel. It's a very shy crowd today. Do we have any questions? No. Okay. So I'll go back to the monitor. The question is the threat of economic punishment a good enough reason to attract countries to stay in the EU? So when Britain first voted to leave, we often heard the line that other governments would need to ensure that they took a very tough line on Britain to avoid, in the phrase that the ambassador used before, to avoid cherry picking, partly for fear that if they were to allow Britain to get a very nice deal, then other countries might seek that as well, and they might seek it outside of the European Union. Stefaan, maybe that's one for you. Do you think that, well, I don't know if you'll accept the premise, but if you do, is the threat of economic punishment a good enough reason to attract countries to stay inside?
On the issue of economic punishment, quote unquote, which is what the question says, I think one has to understand that the reason why the European Council says, you can't participate on a sector-by-sector basis, economic sector-by-sector basis in the single market, or you cannot cherry-pick one of the four freedoms. There is an indivisible package of free movement of people, goods, services, and capital, is to protect the integrity of the single market, which is economically beneficial for all of us. And so, if there is any economic loss resulting from leaving that single market, that is not a decision that the EU27 took, obviously. As President Juncker said, it's the UK who's leaving the EU, it's not the EU that is leaving the UK. So there is no sense of punishment in here, there is just a number of facts and consequences that follow from leaving the single market and leaving the customs union, which are the official positions of the British government today and which are the positions that we work with today, contained in the Article 50 letter and in the white paper. We know there's a debate in London. Well, let's leave time to that debate in London to as President Juncker said, let the dust settle on that debate. But there is no such notion of punishment in the Brexit debate from our side.
But that debate in Britain that is now starting to play out, one place it may end up is back where David Cameron was in his renegotiation, which is there are huge concerns about freedom of movement in the United Kingdom. We can't wish them away. Is there any possibility of some long-term relationship that involves something close to membership of the single market rather than just an integration with it, that includes an element of restriction on freedom of movement, an emergency break, requiring a job offer, anything like that? Or does that remain completely off the table?
There is the one model that comes closest to what you're, sorry, I should put this differently. There are different models out there in terms of the future relationship between the UK and the EU. And one is a Norway model, but that is the whole single market acquis. Now, your question seems to hint at reviving the discussion we had with the British before the referendum, but it is very clear that is null and void. There was a settlement that contained a number of issues there, but that is off the table. It was very clear from the set of 27 that was done in view pre-referendum, but post-referendum, and that is also written by the European Council, that settlement no longer exists.
Ambassador, please.
I can put it very, very simple. I think the biggest deterrent against further exits is the indivisibility of the four freedoms. As long as we stick to that, I think we're on the safe side. If we start, taking them apart, then the risks would be considerably higher.
We've got a few minutes left. There's a particular question on the monitor here that I think may turn out to be one of the trickiest issues of all in the discussions ahead. And I don't know how deeply our panel want to go into it, but that's the border issue with, in the island of Ireland. The question is, what should be done about the only EU-UK land border between Ireland and Northern Ireland? And it fascinates me because unlike the discussion over the money, which is going to be, I think, a fairly straightforward political tussle, unlike the very high-profile issue of citizens' rights, on this particular issue, I think everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants to ensure that we don't end up with a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and the North. We don't want to erect custom checks. We don't want to have passport controls and all the rest of it. But no one knows how to do that if you have Britain leaving the single market, and in particular leaving the customs union. This is a priority issue. It's one of the 3 issues that's going to be discussed in the first phase of the talks. But the guidelines, if I remember the phrasing correctly, call for flexible and imaginative solutions on this, which to my mind looks like code for we don't have a clue what to do. So I wonder if, I don't know if anyone here on the panel here has given a lot of thought to this issue, but I'd certainly be interested to hear about it.
I don't have a solution to it, but you're right that it's, as you said, that wording does hint at, could somebody put forward ideas, please, because we don't know what we're going to do here. But the context, I think, again, is actually reflective of the Brexit debate in the UK, that Northern Ireland, I think people should appreciate, in Great Britain, in England, Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland falls off the mental map of British politics. The DUP have suddenly popped up and people are kind of like, who are the DUP? Who are these people? It's always been a very distinct political place. It's always had its own political parties. It has clearly a different policing and security concerns, different economic concerns and so forth. One of the most important developments that's just happened in this general election, which again hasn't passed that with much comment in the UK, is that because Sinn Féin don't take their seats in the House of Commons, there is now no member of the House of Commons to represent the entire nationalist/Catholic community in Northern Ireland, because the SDLP lost their seats. So that ends several hundred years of representation in the House of Commons for the, should we call the Catholic nationalist community in Ireland or Northern Ireland. That's gone, and it hasn't passed with much comment in the UK, which is slightly remarkable if you think about it. But people in the UK, they remember the IRA. Certainly the older generation, this was an issue with Jeremy Corbyn, especially during the campaign. The younger generation don't. But the idea that, why can't there be a hard border? Well, there's never been a hard border. Why is it a problem to kind of put a border there? People don't understand the links between the two parts of Ireland, and especially that even for some of the kind of the hardliners in Northern Ireland, on the loyalist and the kind of the unionist side, this is a kind of a key issue. The DUP are making this a key issue. It just doesn't kind of work in British people's minds. It's just, you know, why are we thinking about this? We've never had to think about this before. It has always fallen off the map. It's a very strange place. And to tell people in the UK, there are still bits of violence in Northern Ireland. The situation is not as stable as you might think it is. There's still a peace wall. I know they've tried to get rid of it. It comes as a real shock to people. So again, to what extent are the British people prepared to make the sacrifices necessary here to maintain the Northern Ireland peace process is debatable.
And there have been extraordinary developments here, even before anything has really happened. I mean, now for the first time, people are actually starting to think seriously about the reunification of Ireland, which the Irish government, Enda Kenny, managed to get an insertion of into the negotiating guidelines. And of course, one of the proposed solutions to this apparently intractable problem has been, in effect, to shift the border in some of its elements to the Irish Sea, so between the north and the mainland. I think this is something that the new Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, has proposed, but of course this is going to be anathema in particular to the unionist community, because all of a sudden you start to feel like you're being sucked back into reunification with the Republic. It just goes to show why it's such a tricky issue. I don't know if any of the other panelists wants to contribute on this.
Just a small remark. There is another hard border. You're forgetting about Gibraltar.
Yes.
We got a slight problem there as well, and Cyprus too, yes. So there are going to be many such problems as we start looking at the facts on the table. And I think, pragmatically speaking, there will be only one solution, that is staying in the single market. And when we had the referendum, there were many who said we would stay in the single market. I can't now remember, but we were given assurances that we weren't voting on leaving the single market. So all the people who say it would be going against democracies to stay in the single market are wrong, because that is demonstrably not the case. And all of these problems we're talking about, the EU citizens problem, the UK in the EU problem, the Gibraltar problem, the Northern Ireland problem, all of those are solved by one fell swoop if we stay in the single market. And that's got to be the right way forward somehow.
Stefaan, does that solve the problem?
Well, there are ways to solve the problem, but let's just define the problem first. And again, this is based on the official British position is we're leaving the customs union, we're leaving the single market. So that is what we are reflecting on. And then there are the work we have done on imaginative solutions to avoid a hard border, which is what we all want and what we all must achieve. Now, it would be imprudent of me to start talking about different scenarios on what such imaginative solutions would be. It is possible to do that. It is possible to avoid a hard border, but also reassure the 27 on the integrity of the single market and the product rules and standards of products coming into the single market. And in a scenario where the UK leaves the customs union, which is what we have faced with, which we are faced with today, there will have to be some kind of custom controls as well. But it is possible to reassure the 27 on those issues and also avoid a hard border. But what I would say is that, we have been working very hard with the outgoing Irish Prime Minister, and will no doubt continue doing so with the new Irish Prime Minister taking office today, I believe. But we also will now need to listen to our British friends at the negotiation table, because we need some ideas from our British friends what taking back control of borders and laws means for Northern Ireland and the border there. And I think it's important that we listen to them now also and get their position and their ideas for the imaginative solution that we need to find.
Thank you. We're about to run out of time, so maybe I can simply just ask all of you to deliver some concluding remarks. We've covered a pretty wide ground during this conversation. So I don't know, maybe Tim, if you want to start, how optimistic are you?
Well, clearly if Theresa May had won a majority of 50 or 100, I never believed 100 was possible, but 50, we'd be having a very clear discussion today about a hard Brexit and Theresa May going for this. People who expected a big majority for Theresa May would mean a soft Brexit, I think, completely misunderstood the dynamics within the Conservative Party. So everything is up in the air. I'd still kind of have to say I'd toss a coin 50-50 now as to whether or not there's some form of soft Brexit or hard Brexit. It's still kind of up in the air, much more kind of in flux than it was before. But then, you have, I've written for a long time about, and forgive me for this title, about 50 shades of Brexit. That actually this isn't just this false dichotomy of in or out. It never really has been. There'll always be some form of kind of connections, although where the shades will be is not clear.
I am much more optimistic, perhaps because I'm only really half British, and I believe in the European Union, but I also believe in the rationality of the British people, and I think Brexit is an existential issue, both for the Brits and for the European Union, and we shouldn't allow it to happen, because if it happens, Britain will go down, the European Union will have a lot of more problems than if we can keep Britain in the European Union, at least in the single market. And my plea would be with the negotiating teams to emphasize collaboration, the positives that are to be gotten from that collaboration, and to emphasize the human issues rather than to harden in that debate. And if that could be done, and we can also find a way to inform the British public and to get the British public to want to stay in the single market, then I think it can be done. And I hope very much it will be done sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Ambassador, some concluding thoughts?
I wish Emmy was right. But I'm not sure whether I can share her optimism. I think this is the moment to point out to the title of this panel, which says "Bad or Worse." And my understanding is that this is going to be a lose-lose process in any case, and that the issue is about how much we lose in the process and in the final result. Let's not forget, the cliff edge scenario is by far not off the table. It still can happen, despite what we all, I think, collectively would prefer, to have. Even if we all prefer, to avoid it, it simply can happen like that. So don't let us forget that. Thank you.
Stefan.
Well, I'd say let's get the two chief negotiators together as quickly as possible.
On Monday?
Let's get them together as quickly as possible. Let's be constructive and keep calm in that negotiations. Let's focus on the priority issues that we identified and make progress very quickly, hopefully. On the side of the 27, I think we have a stable, mandated, accountable chief negotiator who will report to the European Council and the General Affairs Council at 27. So if we can start in a positive spirit to tackle this together, I think we can make progress quickly. But the political will have to be there on both sides.
Thank you very much. And it just leaves me to announce the result of the poll, which I think you can see in front of you anyway. 56% of those who voted think that Brexit will be bad for the EU, but 44%, which is a larger number than I expected, think it will be good. So, well, we will see. Thank you very much to our panelists for an excellent discussion, and thank you very much for listening. Have a good rest of the day.